Why my Instagram is not going live?
It takes a few seconds to kick in. There we go.
Okay.
You able to go live as well on
Yep.
Instagram? Okay, perfect. So we're live then. So,
Amazing.
all right.
Yeah.
Ishpreet,
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our live today. We're having a live seminar or webinar on fire safety and compliance with Officer Sean McKibben. So we'll give everyone a minute or two to join, and then we'll begin the session. And in the meantime, if you have any questions that you want officer to answer, please put in the chat, and we'll be addressing all those questions for you. So we can write that, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, yes. Thank you. So I'm Ishpreet. I run a property management company in Belleville. We specialize in student rentals, but we also take care of the long-term rentals as well. But yes, if you're looking for any property management needs, give us a call. We'll be happy to answer your questions and queries and help you make the best informed decision.
Amazing. And I'll
Yep.
introduce myself. My name is George Wang. I'm a investor and I'm a realtor. I have a real estate team called Team George Wang in the city, and our team, for the most part, helps working with investors and involved in properties, any kind of income generated property. That's kind of out of our specialty. Buy, sell. If you're looking to flip a property or buy a property that makes money, or sell one because you want to get out of it, that's our specialty. We sell things that make money, and we understand from that perspective. And okay, well, I think we have a couple of people joining us live already.
Perfect.
Want to get started?
Yes. So I'll be introducing Officer Sean McKibben. Thank you, Sean, for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking the time out and educate everyone on the fire safety and compliance and the importance of that in Belleville. So a brief introduction. I'm just reading out over here on an external screen. So Sean has been in the industry for 19 years in the fire and life safety industry. He's been 7 years in the private sector as a fire protection consultant, 12 years in the public sector as a fire prevention officer with Toronto Fire Services, Oakville Fire Department, Belleville, and Emergency Services. He has played a very different roles, like a building department plans examiner, fire investigator, fire inspector, and as well as in public education. Sean also voluntarily participate in firefighter with the Sterling and Rawdon Fire Department. When it comes to education, Sean has done a Bachelor's of Science in Fire and Safety Engineering Technology with the University of Cincinnati and Diploma with Fire Protection Technology with Seneca College. And he got so many of certifications. It's amazing to see. He's been a firefighter, fire investigator, fire and life safety educator, fire instructor, and fire inspector. So all in all, I can say he's a wealth of knowledge, 2 decades of experience in fire and life safety system. So yes, welcome Sean. Welcome here over to our live webinar. So I've introduced myself, but I would also take that opportunity to give it to you to introduce you to our public. And here you go.
Okay. Well, you did a good job. That's pretty much my background. I do work for the Belleville Fire and Emergency Services currently. I'm a fire prevention officer. Our roles here are fire investigation, public education. We do fire inspections. So it's quite a large role, but it's a small municipality in terms of cities go. I really like what we're doing here today. It's something, in terms of public education, I think is somewhat lacking in fire departments in regards to reaching out to the building owners, specifically the real estate agents, anybody with invested interest in the even in the residential market. I think education is somewhat lacking, and I like this opportunity to be able to answer questions and go through the fire code and just go through the purchase and sale process and how we're involved. So thank you for having me.
Perfect. Now, thank you, Sean. So I'll just jump into the questions then that we often get and we often hear from investors when we're working with them. So what is the common when it comes to residential buildings? What is the most common fire code violations that you see in the, let's say, the residential building, if you can talk about the multifamily, or as well as the rooming or the student rental houses as well?
Yeah, it's a wide range. But what you probably hear commonly through the fire department is smoke alarms and carbon monoxide alarms. We're now in 2025 and we're still having pretty significant issues with the maintenance and the installation of smoke alarms and carbon monoxide alarms. We are aware that the issues don't always come from the building owner. The fire code has been changed to not just put all the liability on the owner, but also now on the tenants themselves in regards to maintaining them or making the owner aware that it needs to be maintained, or if it's missing, it needs to be installed. So smoke alarms, COs, major issue. They're also kind of like a zero tolerance for the fire department. Another major issue is egress and exiting. A lot of the times we see blocked exits, issues with combustibles and obstructions in the means of egress. That's pretty common. And depending on the size of the building, the next would be fire separations and closures. That's another big ticket item where, again, sometimes the building owner doesn't realize that, when they're swapping out a door, that door may be a fire door. Or if there's holes in the walls, that maybe not just be a cosmetic issue, that may be a fire code issue. Yep. So those are really the main common issues that we have. You did mention rooming houses. In Belleville, up until just recently, it was almost illegal to have a rooming house in Belleville. And what I mean by that is you were kind of limited to 5 people, depending on the zone that you were in. So a lot of times a rooming house would have 10, 15 people in it. And not only was it not zoned for that area, for that many people, but it wasn't fire code compliant. It hadn't gone through the retrofit or the building permit process. So that was another big issue that we were having. There's lots of different types of fire code violations that you can go through, but those are the main ones, just to go off the top of my head.
Yeah, no, I think you have perfectly touched it really so well. But once you have informed the landlord, okay, you have come across these issues and violations. So what happens if a landlord fails to a fire inspection, and what are the potential fines or consequences then they have to deal with?
So it's a Provincial Offences Act issue. So it's much like a parking ticket or a dog bite. It's not a criminal offense, but the fines are quite significant if you go through a certain process. I'll try to Coles notes it in a way, but there's a part 1 offense and there's a part 3 offense through the Provincial Offences Court. Part 1 is a ticket. So it's much like a parking ticket where we just instantly hand you a ticket, just like a police officer would. And the fines can go up to about $355 for, let's say, a smoke alarm, for instance. And it's per offense. So for every smoke alarm, for instance, that's not being maintained or not installed correctly, you can get a ticket for each one. So depending on how many fire code violations are and how many part 1 offenses there are, you could be in close to 1,000 or so for those offenses. The next one is a part 3 offense. So instead of a ticket, you go to court, and now you have to fight a fine. And depending on whether or not you're an individual or a corporation, the fine's significantly different, and the way we can charge you is different. So I'll try to simplify it. If you're an owner and you're an individual, so you're not a corporation, you could be looking at a $50,000 fine with jail time or both. And if there's subsequent offenses, that goes up to about $100,000 with jail time or both. So pretty significant. The jail time is only about a year, I think, but that's the maximum fine, and that would be a fine that the Justice of the Peace would decide in the end. So you'd go to court, you would talk to you'd have your own lawyer, you would talk to our prosecutor, and then if you decided to fight it, you would go to trial, and then you'd either get away with it or you'd end up paying a fine decided by the Justice of the Peace. If we charge you differently, which is called failure to comply with an inspection order, that's a little bit different. So instead of a ticket, or in combination with a ticket, we issue what's called an inspection order. The inspection order is a legal document stating what the fire code violations are, and throughout that document, it'll reference where it is in the fire code, and it'll also tell you what the reason was and what the action item is. The reason being, let's say you have a smoke alarm not in operating condition in bedroom 3, we would put that, and then it would say you need to repair that smoke alarm. That would be the action item. And so with that inspection order, if you fail to comply with that inspection order by the due date that's set in that order, the fine can be $20,000 a day of non-compliance. So let's say it takes you, 10 days. Well, that's $200,000, right? And if it continues, if it just keeps going, and there really is no end to it. There is a limitation period, but if you're non-compliant, that limitation period just resets, and it's about a year. So not to say that everybody's charged with the maximum fine, but ultimately those are the fines that what we set. Not we set, our prosecutors set through the Justice of the Peace, and then Justice of the Peace decides in the end what that number is going to be. It can be more than what our prosecutors say, or it could be less, but that's what we recommend. Then there's the criminal offense, and that's a little bit different. That's through police. But let's say you're an owner, and because of your negligence, and negligence meaning not maintaining your fire and life safety systems in the building, and the fire ends up killing somebody, you could be held criminally negligent, and that's a little bit different. And now you're going through the criminal courts for that. And in addition, after all said and done, if you had a fire and your insurance companies finds out that maybe an injury or some of the property damage was relatable to a fire code violation, then they won't cover you.
Yep. No, I think you have touched on all the various points, but I just would like to break this particular question into bit pieces so that, let's say you visited a property and you found out they are in non-compliance and you issued a fire inspection order.
Yeah.
But the cost for them to fix those things that have been as part of the inspection order is huge. So let's say it's going to cost them 20-30 grand to fix it. So is there a possibility for them to have an extended time period that they can fix those things, but into some milestones or scopes? So how comfortable or willingness is there with the fire department to work on the completion of those projects in that way?
Ultimately, we're not out to get the public. We want to make sure that the public's safe. And so in saying that, I would say we're not out to charge, we're not out to ticket. Like I said, there's some zero tolerance stuff with the ticket. But ultimately, with the inspection order and the due date that's attached to it, we're giving the owner time. And if let's say we give you a month or two to complete the work, and a month into it, when you have 2 months, you go, oh, you know what, this is going to take longer. You can come back to us and ask us for an extension. And so we you email us, you tell us why you need an extension, what's going on, is there supply chain issues, is there a building permit involved, and it's going to take some time. Whatever it is that you're working on, just keep us in the loop. And if you need an extension, all I do is I submit your extension request to the chief fire official, and then he or she can decide if they want or they agree that it's an acceptable extension. So at that point, we most likely wouldn't have issued a fine, and you're not going to be charged if you're doing your due diligence and you're working towards compliance, because in the end, that's all we're really looking for.
Yeah. So when you answered the previous question that you're looking for carbon monoxide alarms and smoke alarms, so let's say as a landlord, first question is, how should I be scheduling my inspections? What notices I should be giving to my tenants when I want to do such inspections? And second, if I've installed the required smoke alarms, but let's say the tenants or the students are not complying them, how do I justify that I have done my job or my due diligence, but the tenants are not following it? How would you take that, and what would be your sense of surety to say, okay, Ishpreet, you have done your job, but it's not been compliant with other tenants? Or
that's a really common problem. So the first part, when we come out and do an inspection, we don't need a warrant. Like we have a little bit more power than police in regards to our authority that we were given to by the Fire Protection and Prevention Act. So we can enter any premises without a warrant in a reasonable time frame to assess fire and life safety in a building. If it's an emergency, obviously we respond, and that's a little different story. So, but the owner it has to give 24 hours notice. So typically what we do, as long as there wasn't an emergency and we show up, we work with the owner to pick a day and time that works for everybody. And then, because we don't want you to have any issues with your tenants, or your tenants maybe want to be there. They don't necessarily want us walking through their space. So we work with the owner and the tenants timeline as long as it's reasonable to go in. So the second part to your question was in regards to the timelines that you're supposed to be checking. So no matter what, you have to make sure that the smoke alarm and carbon monoxide alarm, if it's in the building for the carbon monoxide, because it's not required for all residential, is if it's battery operated, you got to make sure that the battery's maintained. We typically say 6 to 12 months to check the battery and replace it, and then test it. If it's hardwired and it doesn't have a battery, you still need to test it every year, because you got to make sure that it's working. Sometimes in the contract, depending on what kind of agreement you have, a lot of owners try to push it on the tenant to say, okay, tenant, you're responsible for the smoke alarm, you change the batteries, whatever. In the fire code, it speaks to owner, and the owner is the person with care and control of the property. So if the owner still has care and control of the property, but also has a tenant, and then now the tenant's responsible for the smoke alarm, it kind of works a little differently. But either way, the fire code's pretty clear. It needs to be maintained, and if it turns out the owner's gone in there, and sorry, I'll back up a little bit. What the owner can do is, let's say you've gone in, you've changed the battery, or you've tested the smoke alarm, everything's in working condition, it's installed correctly, it's not expired, which means not older than 10 years. Then what I would do, and what a lot of owners are doing now, is you take a picture, you make note when you were there, the day and the time that you were there, and some owners are actually getting the tenant to sign basically a form saying that you were there at this day at this time, we checked the smoke alarm is in working condition, and then the tenant will sign. And so that way, when I show up one day and the smoke alarm's ripped down off the ceiling, and let's say it's in February, I could say, owner, how come you're not maintaining the smoke alarm? You could say, hey, I was there in January. I changed the battery, I tested it was working. Here's a picture. Here's a signed form from the tenant saying it was installed and it was working and it's not expired. Then we can hold the tenant accountable, and the tenant can be held to the same fines and the same charges as the owner. So if they disassemble it on purpose, or they knew that there was a problem with the smoke alarm and they didn't let the owner know, the fire code is now speaking to this, and we can hold the tenants liable. And we ticket tenants all the time.
And if you can let us know, what is that price for the tenant fine?
It's exactly the same.
Fine. Okay. Exactly the same. No, perfect. And just another question. So let's say it's a single family home. How should I know what should be the minimum smoke alarms or carbon monoxide detectors? Or if there's a single family but non-conforming duplex, like an additional basement, what is the requirement for the smoke alarms in that scenario? Because most of our homes are in that situation here.
Yeah, so for your own home, it all depends on when it was constructed. So the Ontario Building Code post 2012 came out and said for all new construction, you got to have interconnected smoke alarms in all the bedrooms, in the hallway, on every level. If you have a 2-story, it's on the second story in all the bedrooms. First story, there's a connection, and on the basement, they have strobes and they have smokes, and in some areas you may even have carbon monoxide, and sometimes it's a 3-in-1 device. So you, as an owner, you can't go to a lower level of protection. You have to maintain it with the exact same devices. It doesn't have to be the same name brand if you want to swap them all out, but it has to be the exact same protection. So if you have strobe smoke alarms and they fail, let's say after 10 years, you got to replace them, whatever, you have to replace them with the same. You can't put battery operated ones in there in its place. The fire code doesn't allow you to do that. So you have to maintain what's already there based on the year of construction. So for instance, pre-2012 building code, you only needed smoke alarms in the hallway outside the bedrooms and on every level. So, second floor in the hallway, ground floor, let's say near the stairs, and then in the basement, usually near the stairs, and you'll have a smoke alarm on the ceiling. Now, sometimes back then they were hardwired. So just because they're just standalone smoke alarms and they're hardwired, again, you can't swap them out for battery operated. You have to maintain them as hardwired. And if they're interconnected, then you got to maintain that interconnection. So that goes to the 2-unit residential that you're talking about, typically where you have a basement apartment and then you have ground floor or a ground floor second apartment kind of thing. That's pretty typical arrangement. One, that should have been done on a permit. That already instantly, if you're going to be thinking about buying a place like that, you got to consider that it must have gone through a building permit process.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have a building permit on that unit, you don't even know, one, if it's zoned correctly. You don't know if it was installed correctly. You don't know if the plumbing was done to code. You don't know if the electrical was done to code or under permit. So all these issues, right? So consider that first. Then in regards to the smoke alarms are typically interconnected between those 2 units. So meaning that if you have a fire in the basement, you're notifying the people upstairs and vice versa. Because, you don't know what's going on in the basement below you, and the people in the basement don't know what's going on upstairs. So you need to be able to notify them. And then there's a whole bunch of separation requirements and all that sort of stuff that gets built into it as well. And depending on the layout, you may need different exiting layouts.
Yeah. No, you brought up a really good point. When buying a property, these are the things that you should be looking on. So if you can elaborate more on the fire prevention perspective. So let's say somebody who's planning to buy a property, what should be in conditions? No doubt we get a home inspector to do this, but nobody looks into the fire searches or fire prevention. So if you can touch base a little bit on that, what to look for, what to put in the conditions to protect ourselves when it comes to, so that we're not in the violations of the fire code.
Yeah, and it's a good question because we have a lot of phone calls coming our way with really upset new owners of properties that purchased a property, let's say a 2-unit residential or a triplex or a fourplex, only later to find out that it didn't go through the permit process, or even worse, it's not even zoned to be there. So I'll take you through the typical process with the fire department. Is that when you purchase a property, there's a purchase agreement of sale, and inside that purchase agreement of sale, I forget what section it's in, maybe 8 or something, it'll say you have the right to do a title search, right? To find out if there's any outstanding issues with the property, meaning, let's say you got lien on the property, or let's say, you got an inspection order on the property, there's fire code violations on it. And if there's anything outstanding, what the buyer wants to know if there's anything wrong with the building currently that they're going to have to deal with the moment they buy it. But what that fails to address, I would say, is the overall compliance with codes and regulations. And what I mean by that is, let's say we had never gone to the building. What typically happens is the lawyers and the real estate agents get involved, and they say, oh, we got to find out if there's any outstanding issues with the property. So they come in for a file search. The file search just basically means that we look in our files and see if there's anything in there that should be a concern. And then we let you know if we find anything. What it doesn't do is it doesn't say whether or not your property is in conformance with the fire code. It doesn't say it's in conformance with the zoning or anything like that, because all you're asking for is that if we've been to the building and we saw any issues. So if I was the owner, or at least I was a buyer, I'd be requesting a fire inspection. I would say, and for us, it's almost the same price to do a file search as it is for us to go out and do an inspection. Because at least at the base level for fire, we can go in there and do a general inspection and see if there's anything obvious that we see as a fire code violation. And we'll give you a clearance letter stating that we went there, we took a look, we didn't see anything that's fire code. Doesn't mean you're completely in compliance with the fire code. It just means that, to the best of our knowledge, when we walk through, we didn't see any issues. Yeah. That's huge. To me, that's no different than hiring a building inspector to go in, a home inspector to walk through your building and see if there's any issues with the foundation or whatever. You're doing the same for fire and life safety when you call us in there to take a look. Now the seller may not want that, because if we go there and we find something, then the seller is going to get an inspection order. The seller is going to get, basically it's like calling the police on the seller, because now we're like going in there to assess fire and life safety, and if we find something, we're going to hold the owner accountable for it. And then they don't like it, because all of a sudden now they had a clean slate, and now they've got fire code violations that aren't going to leave the property until it's fixed. Now, is it safer? Yeah, and I think it's important that you do that. So for fire code wise, that's how we deal with it. On the other side of the spectrum is zoning and building permits, which go hand in hand. But I highly recommend, especially here in Belleville, from what I can tell, is that there's a lot of properties that have been chopped up. And what I mean by chopped up is they've been taken as like a single family dwelling. Let's say it was quite a large building, and they've chopped it up into a triplex. They've chopped it up into a fourplex, and they haven't done it legally. And so they haven't gone through the appropriate means, which means, yeah, they may have meters outside, electrical meters outside. They may have all the plumbing in and everything is in place, and you think everything is great. The problem is, the moment that you purchase that property as a fourplex, and then only later to find out that it was an illegal fourplex, not only now is it a civil matter, but if you try to sell the property, you can't sell it as a fourplex. Now it's a single family dwelling. And so you paid a premium on a property that's not that valuable.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I have a couple of follow-up questions regarding answers, more specifically to the one that you just said. Let's say we have a lot of older buildings here that were chopped up back in the 50s, 60s. Let's say they did get permits at that time and they met the fire code at that time, but undoubtedly does not meet the fire code today. What do you suggest for the buyer to do in that case? And what is the fire department's kind of perspective on a property that met fire code at one point but no longer meets it today?
So, good question. Building code doesn't change. So the moment that it was constructed under a certain building code, you don't need a new building permit to address any retroactive issues. However, we do have retrofit in the fire code. So I would say 3/4 of the fire code is like a maintenance document, maintaining what the existing fire and life safety systems that building had. However, in retrofit, which has to do with low-rise, high-rise residential, has to do with 2-unit residential based on a certain date, has to do with rooming, lodging, boarding houses. That's all retrofit, and that's all post like late 90s. So if you're buying an older building that had gone retrofit back in the day, it doesn't necessarily mean it meets all the fire code retrofit of today. All it means is it's very possible that an inspector hasn't gone through again to make sure there isn't anything new. And we're finding that a lot now with a lot of these low-rise sixplexes in Belleville, where you've got a common, let's say you have one exit, which is one stairwell that serves 2 units on every level, for instance. The fire code retrofit 9.5 actually says that you have to have 2 exits on every floor. But it's only in regards to more than 4 dwelling units using an exit. So all of those buildings in Belleville that are 6-unit are technically a violation of the fire code if they only have one single stair serving all 6 units. And that's what we're finding now. And so a lot of building owners now in Belleville are finding out that even though maybe you've had a fire inspector in the past, they just didn't catch it. And so now we're walking through and we're noticing a lot of fire code violations. So again, back to the comment in regards to having us out and doing a fire inspection, that would alleviate that problem, because then we can apply retrofit at that time. But again, it's going to go back on the owner.
Is that what we typically refer to as a fire retrofit certificate, is after you go through and give the sign off on it?
We call it a fire code clearance letter.
Fire code clearance.
It's not just fire code retrofit. Retrofit's part 9 of the fire code. A fire code clearance letter is all of the fire code. So it includes part 2 and part 6 for residential. It includes any other part of the fire code that's applicable.
Gotcha. Okay. I have another question. So I know we have a lot of homes in Belleville where the owner just decided to put a kitchen in the basement and rent it out. Building code and zoning aside, just purely from the fire department's perspective, at what point does it become an issue? Because a lot of times the they call it an in-law suite, and sometimes it actually is for their in-laws. Let's say their mother-in-law wants to live downstairs, just has a little bit of their own living space, but they can freely flow between upstairs and downstairs. And then sometimes, and more often that, maybe the intention was for the in-laws in the beginning, and then they sell it. The buyer says, "Oh wow, there's a basement apartment," and then they decide to rent it out. What would you be looking for in those situations from the fire perspective?
So yeah, and that's common. Italian families actually like to have the kitchen in the basement, so there's certain cultures that just want the kitchen down there. So the fire code doesn't go outside of single family dwelling when it's all one single family. So we don't get our backs up with if you have what looks like a 2-unit residential, when all the signs show that it's not. It's all one family living there. There's internal access between the top and the bottom. We don't really care. I shouldn't say it like that, but it's not any different than a single family dwelling, which means you still need smoke alarms, you still need COs, but you don't have to go through the two-unit residential, which is 9.8 in the fire code. But ultimately you need a permit for the plumbing, the electrical, and any walls and stuff like that you're putting up. That still applies, which is why you said zoning and building department aside, because I know bylaw doesn't like it. The bylaws in Belleville, when they see a kitchen and they see a bathroom and bedrooms down there, their bylaws act a little bit differently than our fire codes do. And they really don't like bedrooms without windows. So it's against their bylaws. So when you start going through that process, the fire code and bylaws tend not to overlap each other. We try to keep it separate because you shouldn't have two laws speaking to the same thing. That's why we tend to do joint inspections with bylaw, just so it may seem like a heavy-handed approach because you got all these officers showing up at your house, but ultimately it's for good customer service. And I know that sounds weird coming from an officer, but it really is, because what you don't want is me to come in and tell you to do all this work and then leave, and then you do all the work, and then the bylaw officer shows up and they say, "Hey, you can't have this here. It's not zoned for it," or you got bedrooms without windows here. Like you can't exist like this, And so they go, "Well, the fire department was here and they said it was fine. I don't understand. Like now bylaws showing up and we can't do it. Like what's going on? How come you guys don't talk to each other?" So you get that backlash, if there's multiple departments involved. But ultimately, I think it relieves some of the confusion in the end about what laws exist and how they'll affect you in the end.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. Now, if there's a particular buyer who's looking at a house and it's just your typical 1950s bungalow, it happens to have what appears to be an apartment in the basement, and let's say maybe the previous family did operate as a single family home with their in-laws, but now they intend on closing that entrance off and renting it out. Would you suggest that they contact fire to see what kind of work is required to get that done, or would that just be calling the police on yourself?
No, well, no, and it's strange. I don't want to get in the weeds here, but retrofit 9.8 only applies to 2-unit residentials that have been in existence before July 14th, 1994. So,
Okay.
so before that date, if you were in existence, I can then apply 9.8 of the retrofit fire code to that space, saying, okay, if this has been in existence back then, I can tell you what fire code requirements will bring this up to code. Now, some of the work that you're doing in there still may require a permit, but it's like a fire code retrofit permit because it's allowing you to do less than what the current code allows you to do. However, if it's after July 14th, 1994, the fire code retrofit section doesn't apply to a 2-unit residential, because the expectation is that they got a building permit to do it. So your only option after that, and that was happening before, where they would send a fire inspector out. That's not happening anymore. So what has to happen is the owner has to take the existing, find out what's there, put it in a building permit, make sure they're zoned for it, and apply for a building permit and accessory dwelling unit. and then they'll get approval through the building department that way. And that will stand the test of time, because once you get a permit for it and you've done your due diligence, you're code and you're safe. And then when you sell your property, you can use it as like a selling feature.
Yeah,
Absolutely. I see too many people who just kind of skirt the rules and say, "Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal." But when in a matter of fact, it is quite important to make sure it's done right.
Yeah, and all somebody has to do is call the authorities on you, right? Let's say you have a tenant that's not happy, or they're being evicted, or whatever it is, and then we show up. One of the first questions I have, like, you have a permit for this? Like, what's going on here, right? Like, I'll notice things about just based on my experience. I'll notice things that are missing in a 2-unit residential, and usually the basement, which is missing fire separations. Maybe it's not interconnected smoke alarms. Maybe the service room isn't separated. Whatever it is, all of a sudden it's pretty obvious to me that it wasn't done on a permit, or even gone through fire code retrofit. And then I'm gonna take you through that process anyways, and you could potentially get charged for it in the meantime. So you don't want to go down that route. And we try to be lenient, to be honest, because a lot of people were told by everybody all the way down the line to the point where they purchased the property that it was legal. I guess I should throw out the term legal non-conforming. You tend to hear that a lot. And when they hear legal and non-conforming at the same time, they think, well, it's good to go. We're fine, right? Like, it used to be non-conforming, but it's legal now. That's only a zoning term. So if you ever hear someone say, oh, this rooming house is legal non-conforming, or this triplex is legal non-conforming, all that means is that it was in existence back in the 70s or prior to that, and they have record of it, but you're not allowed to have that anymore in that zone. So let's say it was a fourplex and they no longer allow fourplexes in that zone. If it was in existence way back then and you can prove it, they call it legal non-conforming. But it's very possible it never went through the permit process. It's very possible, and fire code retrofits not being applied. So even though it's legal non-conforming, and we show up, it's still maybe illegal in the sense that it never gone through the building code or the fire code to make it legal.
Can you share an example, like where you came across a legal non-conforming? Let's say it's a triplex, it's a legal non-conforming triplex, but it's a legal duplex. So, what would be the take on fire department or the fire regulations? How would you take that on? If you can share some of the examples. What
Well,
would
I have examples of both like on site and just a phone call from somebody who was thinking about purchasing a property. So I'll give you both. The phone call that came in was from a buyer, and they had just found out that during the purchase and sale, they found out that it was illegal. Like, it wasn't zoned for a fourplex, and they were looking for a fourplex. And they were confirming with us in our records and through the Freedom of Information and stuff like that, what records we had on the property. And so it turned out that, it wasn't a legal fourplex. So what they did is they just rewrote the contract and said, I'm buying this as a single family dwelling. I don't care that it's been chopped up to 4 units and you've got kitchens and bathrooms and, your all your separate meters for electrical and everything. It is not a fourplex. It is a single family dwelling. You have not gone through the legal process, and I'll give you an offer based on that. So that's one example of somebody finding out early before they bought it. After you buy it, and now you're finding out, it's not great, because everybody's going to know. The zoning department's going to know. Planning probably is going to know. The building department's going to find out. The fire department's going to find out. Basically, everybody's going to be involved because it's not legal. So we want to help the owner in a way of saying, hey, code is telling you to do this. You either, one, have to be zoned for it. So if you're zoned for it, it's a lucky break, because now at least you can kind of move forward with the building permit. Because the moment that you get your building permit closed, like basically it's been issued and closed, then it becomes fire code compliant. So that's the other side of it, where they find out after, and then they have to go through this process with us. Some owners are okay with it. Some owners are pretty devastated. It all depends on the cost, really, in the end, and the headache of hiring engineers and consultants and everything like that.
I do want to ask, what happens in the case that it's not zoned for it and it already exists but done illegally?
If you can't get a minor variance, you're going to have to restore it back to its original condition. And a minor variance is basically like saying, I know it's not zoned for it, but can you let me have this here, please. And so you go to the planning department and you say, can I fill out like a minor variance to this zoning requirement? And it's a lengthy, costly process. And it doesn't mean just because you go through the process, they'll approve it. It all has to do with whether or not, one, the services are even there for it, right? If you have enough water and electricity and all that, they want to make sure they're not overloading the services. And if they do accept it, then you still got to bring it into compliance. So you still have to go through the permit process. But there are options. So they don't just flat out say no, tear it down, or return it back to its original state. They do allow you to try to rectify it the best you can, because the city is aware that we need accommodation, right? If you have a fourplex, why it's not in our interest really to drop it back down to a single family dwelling, right? We do want more affordable accommodation. But the problem is that you're dealing with so many different departments, and they all have their own laws and they all have their own regulations to follow. So you have to go through the process the legal way.
Makes sense. Yep.
Just one more question for me.
Yeah,
I'll give you, let's say, I'll give you a scenario. Let's say you got an anonymous complaint or somebody saying that this house has an illegal apartment. I want you to take a look. You go take a look. You go down there, and it's just blatantly illegal. We're talking about no fire separation, no windows, everything wrong. But someone's living down there. What do you do in that scenario? And what happens to that tenant if the place isn't rectified?
typically that's like a rooming house scenario, where you've now chopped it up. You've got mattresses in the living rooms, and then people living in closets and all that sort of stuff. And it's like, let's say it's just a single family dwelling that's been chopped up to a rooming house. The owner has options, and so a rooming house isn't a rooming house until you have more than 4 people living there and paying for rent or providing services for their accommodation. And usually what happens is they all have bedrooms and they share a washer and they share a kitchen, like that sort of setup. You don't have much time as an owner to rectify it. Normally you get some sort of fine almost instantly. If it's as bad as what you're saying, you're either going to get charged or you're going to get ticketed. The problem with those places too is that a lot of people don't know law. Either it's the owners or the tenants themselves. They don't understand. Smoke alarm goes off, they take it down, it's noisy, they take the battery out, right? Then we show up and there's not one smoke alarm, there's not one working carbon monoxide, it's all shut down. So obviously we take life safety approach seriously. So we'll end up like sometimes even installing smoke alarms in COs, just so the occupants are safe. But then we tell the owner, you have an option here. You can change this into a rooming house, like a legal rooming house, because Belleville's changed their zoning laws now to allow rooming houses in all of Belleville. So there are limitations, again, windows and 100 square foot per person, property standards, all that sort of stuff. But what typically happens is they evict the occupants, because if they can take those 10, 15 people and drop it down to 4, it's just a single family dwelling in the eyes of the fire code, and then they're now compliant. And it's usually the quickest way of doing it. It's not ideal. I'm not a fan of evictions. I don't want people to have to find somewhere new to live or end up on the street. So we take that seriously. But the owner's the owner, and a lot of times they don't have a landlord-tenant agreement. They just push them out really quickly, or move them onto another building they own and we don't know about it. It's very common, but that's what happens very, very quickly. If it's poor living conditions, that's when you get bylaw involved.
What about just let's say a basement apartment with upstairs you have a single family, and then in the basement you have a single family, but there's no fire separation, there's not enough windows, the smoke alarms aren't connected, etc.
So we still treat it like a 2-unit residential, but we go through part 2 and part 6 of the fire code. So we can't use retrofit because most of the time it was just done at a later date, past July 14th, 1994. So we say damaged fire separations, you have interconnected smoke alarm system that's not working, you're not maintaining your smoke, whatever it is. The fire code still speaks to all those individually as like maintenance items. So, the door that connects the 2 units, let's say the one that leads to the basement's not a closure. Well, that's a fire code violation. No self-closing device, that's a fire code violation. So there's another way of going about it than outside of fire code retrofit, and that's pretty common too.
Okay, so it's they get a letter of everything that they need to do. As long as they do it, it's all good.
Yeah. Well, in a way, but ultimately, what happens is every inspection order that we issue, guess who gets a copy of it? The chief building official. So now the chief building official is getting a copy of our inspection order saying, hey, you have a 2-unit residential here, and you have all these fire code violations, and then they look into their system and go, what 2-unit residential? There's no accessory dwelling unit there. You didn't get a permit for that. And then the building inspector shows up.
Gotcha.
So let's say if an investor plans to buy a property and he's like, okay, I want to do student rentals here. It's a single family and whatever the situation is. So if you can just give us a clear steps, what is the step one? Look for the zoning, if it's in the right zoning.
Yeah.
And if you can talk about what would be the fire code requirements that he has to look for to make sure that he's in compliant with the fire code requirements when it comes to rooming houses or student rentals in that way.
Yeah, it's going to be hard because basically the owner is ultimately responsible for compliance with the fire code, which means they need to have a copy of the fire code. You can download the fire code online. It's through e-laws, and you can it's called Ontario Regulation 213/07. If you Google that, you can get a PDF copy of it. All regulations are public knowledge. If I'm saying you're not in compliance with the fire code, you should be able to get a copy of the fire code to know what you have to follow.
Yeah.
The next step is really understanding it. It's written by lawyers, and it's a very difficult document to kind of get yourself through. We can somewhat help you understand. Especially if we show up, we can kind of take you through the fire code and say this is what you're in violation with. But ultimately, there's headings throughout the fire code that helps you get to where you need to go. So parts 2, part 6, and part 9 are all ones that are going to be typical for what we're talking about here today. Parts 2 are general compliance. Smoke alarm COs are in there. Part 6 is maintenance of fire and life safety systems. So if you have an interconnected smoke alarm system or a fire alarm system or sprinklers or whatever you have in your building, that's about the maintenance of it. And then part 9 is where retrofit kicks in. And so we fall for rooming, boarding, and lodging houses. We typically fall. It's called 9.3, section 9.3 of the fire code. 2-unit residential pre July 14th, 1994 is 9.8, so 9.8. And then the low-rise residential is 9.5. So all they have to do is scan through. Once they find it online, they scan through the regulation, and it'll take them to one of those sections. And then if you read it, there's headings. It's not entirely impossible to read for the general public. There's a lot of and/or statements. There's a lot of exclusions and stuff like that, and that's where we can kind of come in and help you through the process. If you're a building owner and you just want to do your due diligence and you just want to be code compliant, I have no problem talking to the public and taking them through the process. But what we're not allowed to do is consult. So we can't act like your engineer or architect or fire protection consultant, because what we can't do is tell you what to do in certain circumstances, because if you do it and it turns out to be an issue later down the road, or I told you to do something and then I looked in the code later and it was not the fire code, it's not great. But what we can do is we can point you to the area of the fire codes that you need to consider. And then if you have any questions about it, we can take you through that process. So it's a little bit difficult to say, what should an owner do? Because in our world, you should already know before buying the property, right? So, or hire a property management company that knows, so then you don't have to. And so then they can do their due diligence prior to you buying a property or after you get it and say, listen, we've gone through the property, we've looked at all the fire code stuff that we're typically seeing in these properties, and here's the concerns that we have. And then because what it's really important to understand, especially when you have a property manager, a property management company, the fire code speaks to owner as ultimately the person who's responsible, which could be anybody with care and control of the property. So that can be the building owner, that can be a property management company, that can be a director of a corporation, that can be a tenant, right? Or somebody that's running a business. So the owner is a very general term of who's ultimately responsible for this building and who's ultimately responsible for the fire life safety systems in it. That's who we're going to hold accountable, or all the above. So taking you through the process, if I was buying a property, I would do it exactly how I said. Check with the building department if you can, see if there's any permits out for a triplex or a duplex, whatever it is that you're buying. And then if they say, well, you're not the owner, you need the owner to give us authorization, then you should have that in the contract, or at least the agreement of purchase and sale, saying, I can look into seeing if I can find building permits on the property. I can look into well, you'll know zoning, because zoning is different. You can look at that without any help. And then have a fire inspector go out there and do an inspection. If the buyer shouldn't be worried if you ask for those things. If you say, hey, do you have any permits for this? Do you have any outstanding fire code violations? Can I have a fire inspector come out here and take a look? If the owner's like, no, you're not allowed. Well, why? What's the problem? Like, what you should be, look, here's my building permit, sure, have the fire inspector out here. I've got all my ducks in a row. I don't have any concerns. Even if you propose it and they say no, that's a red flag already, right? Yeah. Even before you go down the road.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Just save your time.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So thank you, Sean. I wanna talk about some emergency responses. So what happens? In what case do we need a fire emergency plan? Like if it's a small rise building, residential building, or a small multifamily, and what should we do if a fire occurs? What should be the action step for the tenants? What should be for the owners? And what should be the action steps for the property management company?
So you can either do it voluntarily or it's required by the fire code. And what I mean by that, you mentioned a safety plan. So it's a fire safety plan. A fire safety plan for residential is required when you have more than 10 people living in the building. Once you have more than 10 people living in a building, it's required by code. You have to have a fire safety plan. You can attempt to write it yourself. It's usually quite difficult for an owner to do it on their own. There's some drawings involved. But ultimately what the fire safety plan is for is not only to include all the maintenance requirements in the back, so you don't have to read the fire code. It's right there. This is all the things I need to maintain and the reasons why and who's responsible for doing it. So there could be daily checks, there could be weekly checks, there could be monthly checks, there could be checks every 6 months, there could be yearly ones. And most of the year ones are done by a professional. If you have fire extinguishers, you have to have a professional come and inspect and check and maybe even maintain them. You have fire alarm system, same thing. If you've got emergency lighting, exit signage, all the fire and life safety systems of the building, you're having somebody check it. If you have a property management company or someone in maintenance or something, then they can do some of the daily, weekly, monthly checks on their own. So it kind of all depends on the building and who's responsible for that.
Oh, perfect. What type of, since you were talking about the fire extinguishers, what type of specific fire extinguishers we should be looking at, and what should be the location of it, and how many do we need it?
So again, that all depends on the property. Easiest way to look at it is if it's a single family dwelling, you don't need a fire extinguisher. Okay. Once you have multi-unit residential, a fire extinguisher is typically required only in the common areas. So if you have a common exit that everybody's using, you'll normally see it on every level. You'll see it on the ground floor. You'll see it in the basement if there's a common basement. You'll see it in service rooms, and you'll most likely see it in a kitchen, and you'll see it sometimes in laundry rooms. So that's typical. Some people like to put them in the dwelling units themselves. Mm-hmm. A lot of the times those things are not used, they're not maintained, they may not even work. We don't necessarily recommend doing that sometimes because in a time of an emergency, they try to grab these things and they don't work, or they don't know how to use them, or they back themselves into a corner. For us, we're very happy to just have them leave, and then we can take care of that issue. So that for fire extinguishers, that's kind of the common denominator. The fire code goes into very specific detail about how many, the size, how close they are to each other. But usually it's not until you get into like larger buildings where there's like distance requirements and everything like that, like 25 meters, for instance. The size, you can't go lower than what we call a 2A. 2As are like these small ones. And then it goes higher from there, but they always say 2A, like 10 BC or something like that beside it, or 5A or 10A or whatever it is. They just get bigger and bigger. you could probably get away with a 2A, but if you ever needed to use it in an emergency, they're really small. They don't last very long. You know, it's almost like a false sense of security. So normally they go with like the 5-10 pounders. But ultimately, the monthly checks are required, which means somebody's signing off on the tag saying, I came here, I looked at it, it's not in the red, nobody's used it, it's not broken or damaged or something stuck inside the nozzle or whatever. They're just looking at it to make sure that it's not been used and damaged. Then the yearly one, they do a more in-depth inspection on it. And that has to be done every year. For people who only have like 1 or 2 extinguishers, if you buy a new one every year, you don't need to maintain them yearly, because you're buying a brand new one every single year. And for the cost of having someone come out and maintain them, some people find it just better off just buying a new one and then checking it themselves every month and calling it a day. But if you have like 20 of them, well, then that's a little bit different. But if you only have 1 or 2, like you don't need to have a professional company go out there, and as long as you're replacing it before the year's end.
Makes sense.
I have a follow-up question regarding the fire extinguisher. So I know one person in our community had this question earlier before our live stream, and he said that he's currently having a bit of a disagreement with his tenant in his. I think he has a low to mid-rise apartment building, and the tenant is arguing that they require a fire extinguisher within their dwelling, and the owner is in disagreement.
Right.
Where can they get more information to educate each other? And because it seems like your answer is it's not required, but where can the landlord get resources to reassure the tenant that it is not required?
Okay.
Or is there someone they can contact or have the tenant contact?
Well, they can contact us. They can contact local fire department. They'll be
Okay.
able to take them through it. But for the installation requirements, they can go into part 6 of the fire code, and it's section 6.2.
Okay. And
So if they go in there and and it's online, so they could just cut and paste it in an email and just say, this is where fire extinguishers are required, this is where they need to be. And it does not say it needs to be in your dwelling unit. It'll say it needs to be in the common areas or whatnot. It all depends on the, where it is, but mostly it's talking about like the distance above the floor, how it has to be mounted and all that sort of stuff. But ultimately, we don't like seeing them on the ground. They're not really supposed to be on the ground. They have to be mounted. But you're saying, oh, sorry, go on.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, sorry. No, I didn't hear what you said there. I was just saying, in regards to a dwelling unit themselves, the fire code doesn't require a fire extinguisher inside. But that's why you notice, like if you go into even a low-rise residential, the moment that you walk outside your unit and you start walking down that corridor to one of the exits, you'll see it. It's like hanging on the wall or inside of a cabinet or something. It's always outside the unit. The dwelling units are kind of exempt from that.
What I was saying, like we already talked about the fire safety plan and who should be designing it. If it is more than 10 tenants, then we need it. But what happens in both cases if it's a single family, there are less than 10 people living in, or you can say a single family dwelling unit? If a fire occurs, what should be the immediate steps a landlord take, or a property management company should take, or a tenant should take in that manner?
So you're saying like post-fire, or you're saying like during
Let's
the
say a fire happens, if a fire occurs.
If a fire occurs, the first thing we tell everyone is to contact their insurance company. That's ultimately the number one thing that you want to do. And depending on the severity of the fire, they could be looking at, they need an alternate accommodation, right? They're not going to be able to stay in that unit anymore. It's probably going to be toxic, and it's very possible it's going to affect some of the other tenants if you've got a multi-tenanted building. So insurance companies, number one, because you need to find out if you're even covered to bring them somewhere else, or if they're on their own, or what's the situation. The tenants themselves, hopefully they have contents insurance. That's a big one, because a lot of times they lose everything and they don't have insurance, and that's it. And so now they don't have accommodation, and now they don't have any clothes, they have no items, and they have nowhere to go. A lot of times what happens is Red Cross will kick in and they'll have a place for a couple of days to stay, but it's not permanent, and it's not for a long period of time. It's just to kind of get you back on your feet. So it's pretty devastating. So number one, insurance company. So when I go out and do a fire investigation, the moment that I finish my investigation at the end, I release that scene back to the owner. So as soon as I release the scene back to the owner, that's kind of it. Like the owner now is fully responsible for that building. There's liability if somebody from the public now enters that building because it's on fire. It was on fire. Now, if we allow people to go back into the building, that's a little bit of a different story. But if it's like condemned and you can't go in there, the insurance company will have a board up service program where somebody will come and put like plywood up on all the windows and the doors so that the public can't gain access to it. There's odd situations where some people buy a property and they don't move in, and then the contractor's in there, and the contractor's the one that set the fire, or fire happens. It's a little bit more difficult to find the owner. But it depends on if you're a tenant or your owner, what the next steps are. It's kind of case by case at that point. But the number one, 100%, one, obviously, if you're in the fire, get out and stay out, and go to a spot where everybody's going to be able to see you and account for you, especially the fire department, because if we think you're in there, we're going and looking for you. But after the aftermath, it will most likely be closed up if it's bad enough. And you don't want to be going in there on your own. And really what you want is you want a steady transfer between the fire investigator and the insurance company. Because if I release a scene to you and then you release a scene to the insurance company, or the insurance company arrives and I can release the scene to them, that means that you were never in possession of the property after the fire. Because the moment that you have possession of the property and then the insurance company comes later, if you go into the building or somebody goes, now there's a question. Well, what happened? Did you take something out? Did you mess around with some things? What if somebody gets hurt? Who's liable, right? So you want there to be as a short enough time between when the fire department leaves and when your insurance company kicks in and takes over.
I see. I just want to take you back. If you remember, on Coleman Street, there was a fire that happened recently, and what you're talking about just happened. So let's say after the fire, you do the fire investigation and you find out both cases. In one scenario, let's say the homeowner or the landlord is responsible because he was not in a compliant code, and that's the reason the fire happened. In the second scenario, it happened due to the tenant's negligence. So is there any fine associated to it? What are the steps as a fire department that you take to make sure you address both things?
Yeah, and then that's the time when it's almost guaranteed you're going to get a fine. If there's a fire, especially if somebody's injured or dies, like you're going to be held account. And the fire code did not really let up. I mean, every fire code violation they're going to hit you with, and you're going to get hit with. It's one of those things where it's like, we try our best to go out there and spread public education and go in and help people like we're doing today, like try to notify you and tell you about all the dangers and then keep your smoke up. But the moment that there's a fire and somebody's injured, if it's the tenant's responsibility, if it was the tenant's fault or the owner's fault, fire code wise, we have to know. We really truly have to know for 100% who's ultimately responsible. If we can't prove that it was the tenant, it falls on the owner for 100%. If we don't have any proof, then how can we possibly hold the tenant accountable? But if the tenant came out and like, yeah, I started the fire, this and this, one, that's a criminal offense if it was arson. But two, fire code violations could be then issued. But for what to do if you're an owner and your tenant set fire to the place, like that's a case by case. Like the police are usually involved. And for fire investigation side of things, we just do we find out the origin and cause of the fire. And then once that happens, if we think it was arson or if we think it was intentional, there's another level to the fire department. It's called the Office of the Fire Marshal, and they have their own fire investigators that come out. And if there's a fatality or if it's a massive fire that involves the public, they have their own investigators that come out and they take over the scene. And it's a different story when they're involved.
Yeah.
For the sake of time, I just want to ask this question that was asked by another one of our community. He says, I have a 6-unit apartment building with electric heat in the apartments and gas for the water heater in the basement. he has carbon monoxide detectors where the hot water heater is, as well as the apartments near that room, but he doesn't have CO detectors on the rest of the building. I'm assuming the other floors.
Okay, so that is in section 216 of the fire code. So if we go there, that's for carbon monoxide. And so it's easier to read it. So this section applies to every building that contains a residential occupancy and fuel burning appliance, a fireplace, or a storage garage. So you said they had a gas-fired hot water heater in the basement.
Yes.
So this section applies. So then it says, if a fuel burning appliance associated with building services installed in a building but not within the suite of residential occupancy. So that's what you're saying, right? It's in the service room, but it's not in the residential unit itself. A carbon monoxide alarm shall be installed in the service room or area where the appliance is installed, adjacent to each sleeping area in each suite of residential occupancy that has a common wall or common floor ceiling assembly with the service room or area where the appliance is installed, and adjacent to sleeping rooms that are not within a dwelling unit. So what they're saying there is that in his situation, let's say it was in the basement, and there was a residential unit touching that service room in the basement, and let's say there was one right above the service room on the ground floor. Then those two would have to have a carbon monoxide alarm. The service room would have to have a carbon monoxide alarm, but everybody else doesn't. So basically, it's like any wall or floor that's like touching, or ceiling that's touching that service room with that appliance. And you have to consider, like, some of these buildings, let's say it could be like a high-rise residential, right? So this applies to all residentials. So you can't expect there to be a service room, let's say, in a basement of a high-rise, but then 30 floors up, you need a carbon monoxide unit. So they go out of their way not to force every single unit to have a carbon monoxide alarm. Do we recommend it? Yeah, of course. Why not? Code-wise, doesn't say you do.
Yeah, as a reference, if you can tell the code, maybe he can look into the recording and
listen. So that's subsection 2.16.2, which is the installation requirements. It's in division B, and that's in part 2 of the fire code.
Gotcha.
Amazing. Yeah, I think we're almost at the end of our webinar, but I do want to ask just like 1 or 2 questions. I don't know, George.
Sure.
So I want to understand, like, what is the vision of the Belleville Fire Department? What are they thinking in terms of, we all want fire safety, and that's what the main job is. But what is your vision, and how you want the community or property management company or local investor groups to add on value to your goals? So if you can talk a little bit about that as well.
Without pumping you up too much, this is what I want. This is what I want. I want real estate agents involved. I want property management companies. Everybody kind of join together, and just because most people just want to know what they have to do, right? They don't want to be stuck later down the road with a building that's all these violations stuck to it, and they're left fronting the bill to fix it. They don't want to get charged, like, and we're not out to get anybody. We try to do our best to spread the word. And like I said at the beginning of this, this what do you call it, like a webinar? Yeah. This is really important to me. This is public education, right? Like anybody who's enforcing any law should educate the public on what those laws are, so that so that everybody's safe, so that everybody complies. When you keep people in the dark, and then I show up and I say, hey, do you not know the fire code? Like, did you not know section 16.2? 26. Those carbon monoxide alarms are like, what are you talking about? Right? No, I didn't know, but I'll do it. And that's the common thing, is where, although ignorance isn't an excuse, there's a lot to this regulation, and I do this for a living, and it's somewhat complicated sometimes for me. So how exactly is the public going to understand it if they're reading this? You know what I mean? Like, there should be more education like this. So I highly recommend what you're doing now to the public. And I've been trying to put together something like this, even in person, where you meet somewhere and a large audience. And I've done it many times in the past, but I don't think it's enough. I don't think there's any training out there right now for property managers and property management companies. what you're supposed to do is train them on fire safety plans. One, if you have a fire safety plan in a building, all the supervisory staff are supposed to be trained on the plan before they have any responsibility under the plan. But you ask any of the supervisory staff when you walk into a building, have you been trained on the plan? They don't even know what the plan is, right? So that's how far backwards we've gone, where people don't even know what the fire safety plan is. They don't know what their responsibilities are. Now you have maintenance individuals, let's say somebody working in a building, they don't really know fire code. They just pick up from where the last guy left off, and the last guy didn't train them. And so you have this turnover, this insane turnover over and over and over again, where we're creating like new faces every 6 months. And we're like, hey, were you trained on the fire safety plan? What's that? Are you maintaining the fire and life safety systems, daily, weekly, monthly checks that you're supposed to be doing? They go, what are you talking about? And so this is, it's actually going backwards. It's getting worse over the years. And it's because of this crazy turnover. And it's expensive for an owner to keep training people over and over and over again. Every single time they get new staff, it's like you're training them again and again and again. And there's no easy way to do it. There's no one-stop shop that you can just download some YouTube video or something and get all the information you need, and then now you can carry on doing your job. The expectation is that the owner is supposed to be doing that.
Yeah.
So the owner hires a property management company, and then the property management company is supposed to be doing it, and they're trying to figure it all out in the process. So it's like this, and then even the property managers, like they're turning over like crazy over and over and over again for the same property. So it's really, really difficult, and it's not just these types of occupancies where we have issues, but I would say that the Belleville Fire Department in the past, at least the 3 years that I've been here, we've come a long way. There's been a drastic change in our management. There's been a complete turnover in the fire prevention division. A lot of knowledge now, a lot of public education initiatives we're putting out there. We're doing stuff like this now, and I don't know too much about Belleville prior to it, because I was in Oakville and Toronto prior to that. But I have seen a really, really positive change, and we're going out to a lot of buildings now, and we're, I don't want to say targeting, but we're focusing on residential. We're focusing on the rooming houses. We're trying to get to all the low rise. We're trying to get to all the high rise, because ultimately that's, if there's going to be a fatality, it's going to be where people sleep. And that's why we want to make sure that they're all fire code compliant. And we're lenient and we're fair, except when we see complete disregard for the fire code. And unfortunately, ignorance is not necessarily a free pass either. But that's what we want to see. We want to see the public engagement. We want to see people trying to educate themselves and learn. And I'm an open book, so feel free to contact me if you want to do another one of these, or if any people watching this want just have a couple questions, or maybe we have another webinar that we go through and do the same thing.
Yep. How do people contact you?
The best way is probably calling me. You can also email me, or we have a general fire prevention email. So if you have a complaint that you want to make, it can be completely anonymous as well. Or you just have an inquiry. You can in an email, you can say fireprevention@belleville.ca. That's our email address. I'm S McKibben at belleville.ca. So hopefully you can see my name on here. It's just S and then my last name, and then at belleville.ca. Or if you just want to call me, 613-962-2998. So like I said, I'm an open book. Hopefully I don't get 100 calls over the next couple of days, but I serve the public, and I'm a nerd about it, and I really want to do my best to serve. So
yeah,
well, thank you for having me on.
I just one last question, I think, from our audience, and then we're letting you go, Sean, for sure.
No problem.
Yeah, it's from Rose. She's a realtor, and she serves the Belleville Quinte West area. So our question is, what's the turnaround time to get an appointment from the fire department to come out to do a building fire inspection to see if your dwelling is up to fire code?
So if it's a complaint, or if you're requesting an inspection, two separate things. Complaints we typically do the same day. If you're requesting an inspection, it's kind of like an availability thing. So usually you give your tenants 24 hours notice, so we kind of work it away. But we're very fast. Like it's within a week or two. Like it's almost right away. There is a fee involved if you want a clearance letter. So you'll have to pay the fee. but it's a small fee for what you get in comparison. So yeah, you can just reach out to us at fireprevention@belleville.ca. You can just email, give us some contact info and what you're looking for, and we can very easily accommodate, and we're pretty fast.
Amazing. Perfect. No, this has been a great webinar. Thank you, Sean, Officer Sean. Really appreciate your time. You took out the time, and think it was really a lot of learnings today. And I learned a lot of things, and must be for George for too. But we'll be having these events, as you said. It's all about public education, and we'll be playing our role, giving back to the community to the best we can.
That's great. It's great. It's more than what we can ask for. It's what we want, and I'm happy you guys are doing it.
Yep. Perfect.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sean.
Okay. Take care.
Enjoy your day.
You too.
All right.